first, I'm going to use this project that's already full of stuff to show you around the interface. And to get started, right here, I've got Finder window. I'm on a Mac, but same principle would be true on a PC. So if you're on a PC, you would be looking at your Windows Explorer window. And this is my project folder. You'll see the name of it up here. It's called Spire Insta AE project. That's my project folder. And you'll notice that I've got everything inside of my project folder that I'm going to be using. And even some things that I maybe am not using, but this is where I've put all of my stuff so that I could pull it into my project, and then everything would always be sort of like in this little suitcase of a folder to carry around wherever I go, and I'll make sure that I always have my assets with me if I were to go take this to another computer or upload it to a server or something like that for working on a different machine or sharing with a coworker. So that's going to be the first rule of thumb, is to make sure that you always put everything in the project folder, as opposed to like having pieces and parts on your desktop or in your documents or whatever, right? You need to be able to easily transport this project folder to wherever it is that you might need to take the project. Okay, so let's jump over here into that After Effects application. Currently, I have the project file open, and you might notice that the file name, actually, if I pull that back up, the file name is this one. I have two different versions of it. I have one with audio and one without, and I'm showing you right now the one with audio. And so you'll see that what this looks like is a little icon that says AE on it. It's a little purple icon, and its file ends in .aep. All right, so the file type for an After Effects file ends in .aep. All right, and so that's the actual file that I'm using. But then you'll notice that all of these other things like white.png, strong wind, moving cars.wave, logo.psd, there's an MP4 here, and so on. You'll notice that these are files that are assets that you'll see in just a moment that I've pulled into this .aep file. All right, so it's unlike a Microsoft Word file where whenever you import a picture file or something, that it gets embedded inside of that actual file, you know, the Microsoft Word file. Instead, this .aep file, what it does is it just manages all the links to all of these other connections, these external connections, like, you know, the .wave and then the .mp4 and the .png files, right? And it just keeps those connections, and that is why it is so critically important that you keep everything inside this folder, so that if you move to go work to another folder, you pass the project on to another person, that all of the files are going to be there for somebody to use, and it won't come up with missing links, right? So anyway, if I jump back over here, this is the default setup, and if you want to make sure always that you're working in a default workspace, you don't have to be, but if you want to make sure that you are, so that it matches with whatever I might be talking about in a default workspace, you can go up to Window, Workspace, and then make sure default is selected. If it is, then you can say reset default to saved layout so that it looks like this. Okay. Now there are some different panels that I want to point out. First of all, if I click on a panel, you'll notice that there's a blue box that comes up around it, and this is very similar to the way that Premiere Pro works. Whenever I change my focus to different panels, then the panel will be highlighted with a blue outline. Okay, so that's something that's very important right up front. All right, and so over here, if I click on, you know, info, it expands. If I click on audio, it collapses info and then expands audio, and so on. I can click on any of these different things, right? Character, paragraph, and so on. Effects and presets, that's one that you might use a lot. Okay, the other thing that's really important I want to point out over here is that this panel on the left is where your composition will be created. And so you'll notice that right here we have something that looks like a composition. It seems like it's a composition file, but what it is whenever you create a new project or you bring something into After Effects to create a new project, what it's going to do is it creates a composition. If you've ever used Premiere Pro, it's very similar to whenever you're creating a sequence, okay? And very similar to Premiere Pro, whenever you create a sequence in Premiere Pro, then you would have a sequence with its timeline. Well, similarly, in After Effects, this thing is called a composition instead of a sequence, but whenever you create a new composition, you can come down here, and this is going to be by default where your composition timeline shows up. And on the left, what you see here are different layers. So this is where it would look a little bit different than, say, in Premiere Pro, if you've ever used it. In Premiere Pro, you would have some channels, right? You would have audio and video channels. This is different. It shows up in terms of layers. So in this way, in some ways, it's sort of more like Photoshop, if you've ever used Photoshop, and that you've got layers here. And so whenever I create the composition, it just creates a space down here, right, where my first asset that is in the composition then would show up as something in this timeline off to the right. And you can scrub this timeline, okay, just like you would in Premiere Pro. And something else too is if you've ever used Photoshop, and for those of you who haven't used Photoshop or Premiere Pro, please forgive me for all of these comparisons, but it is helpful for the people who have used it before. If you've ever used Photoshop's movie timeline feature, this feels very much like the movie timeline in terms of the way that you've got your layers on the left and then you've got your timeline on the right. And additionally, you can even twirl down those layers and you can see different things that you can add. In this case, that's an audio file, and you can see the little speaker next to it, right? With the waveform, that means it's audio. But like if we were, for instance, were to come to this PSD that we dropped into our timeline, then you'll see that there are some different effects that I've added. You can click on transform. You can transform and keyframe things like scale and rotation and opacity and so on. All right, those are some basic transformations that you always get with things. And then here's a video in MP4, and you can see this is the transform. If I twirl it down, again, this is the basic stuff like adding opacity, rotation, scale, and so on. You can also transform position, so if you want something to slide in or slide out. Okay, and then I can twirl that up and collapse everything, right? So this is the composition area. Off to the right, you'll see, as I mentioned before, we've got different options here. And later what we might do is we might reset our workspace so that we don't have quite so many things showing up over here, because this is a lot to take in at once. Just so you know, this is the default workspace. So you can see the different effects and presets. This is where you could go and search for certain kinds of effects. You can explore effects. Similar to Premiere Pro, if I had some sort of effect that I wanted to add, I could grab it and I could just drag it down and drop it on top of a clip. All right, and I'll show you that in a demo later. There are some alignment tools, again, where you can select multiple objects down here in the layers, and then you can just align them, which is terrific. Just very similar to like Photoshop or Illustrator. You have a character panel, right, if you wanted to add type and paragraph and so on, right? So a lot of this might feel very, very familiar if you've used Photoshop before and or Premiere, right? Now up here is where you've got your composition movie playing out, okay? And it's a sort of similar in a way, not entirely, but in a way, to this would be like the composition or the composite like in Premiere, where it shows you everything that's composited down here in this composition timeline, right? But over on this left side, if I were to select, logo, it's going to show me a preview of this similar, not the same, but similarly in Premiere, where it'll show you the source. It's like called the source monitor, where if you select something, if you were to drag it into the source monitor, it'll show you sort of a preview and it'll let you play it and so on. This is not quite the same, like that I couldn't just sit here and play the video from here, but it'll give me a little preview of it that shows me a preview of the logo PSD file. If I twirl down my audio folder and look at these different audio files, it shows me the waveform, right? It shows me all these different things that I'm using. Okay, it tells me what's in stereo, what's not in stereo. And then the other thing too is that if I click on it, you can see that this is used one time. This is not used because it doesn't tell me that it's being used. This is used one time, and so on, right? So you can kind of see like maybe where, if you're not sure if you used it or not without looking down in the composition. So there are lots of different things that you can just really quickly learn about this interface. Up here we've got a tool panel that would allow me to just like quickly, if I wanted to quickly click on the text tool, I could just click here and start typing and it would create a new layer for me. And then if I wanted to control that, you know, the character uh, information about the type that I was creating, then I could come here and I could change it, right? And so on. Okay, so this is just a really quick run through on the interface while we've got some stuff, you know, to look at. And then again, over here on the timeline, if I were to scrub this timeline, you can see that it will do, it's doing like a pretty low fidelity scrub through the timeline as I go through it. And what's nice with this is all I'd need to do is hit the space bar and it will start playing. But one thing that I will point out is that as it starts doing playback, it's not as smooth as, say, in Premiere Pro. In some ways, it's a little bit closer to the way that, say, Photoshop might want to play back video. It's going to be slower. It might drop frames a little bit more. It's not as bad as Photoshop because it's optimized more for doing this kind of work than Photoshop is. However, you know, it does still drop some frames. So if you have a long segment and you know that you really want to work in high fidelity just on a short piece, you also have this ability right here to do this, drag your work area, and you can change it so that the work area is shorter as well. So if I wanted to, well, let's see if I can get the, drag that in, right? I could work on a really short work area and then I could scrub this timeline and it would actually not drop as many frames if I wanted to play that back. Now let's try it. Right, and you see that that's better with real time than, say, whenever I had it all the way out here. Okay, and so I think that this is where it actually ended. All right, and one of the other things too that you can do is you can use this work area to render out a short clip to see how it looks without rendering out your full thing, and it won't take as long, right? But you always want to make sure that whenever you do finally go to render, that you pull your work area back out to everything that you want to keep before you actually do your renders. Okay, but I'm not going to show you about rendering or anything yet. I just wanted to show you really quickly around this default workspace. And so now we're going to move on so that I can show you how to get started with a blank project and import stuff and start to build something like this.